Christmas dinner at the Holbrook estate. Pete announced his pregnant girlfriend would be joining our family celebration. His mother smiled like she'd been expecting her for months. I calmly reached under the table, handed him a beautifully wrapped gift box inside. Were DNA results that would destroy everything he thought he knew about his perfect little scheme. The envelope inside wasn't just about paternity. It was about a 15-year conspiracy that went all the way back to my scholarship to Princeton, and the DNA results proved that his girlfriend's baby belonged to someone much closer to home than anyone could have imagined. By dessert, his mother was in handcuffs. His girlfriend was in tears. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. And I was finally free from a family that had been using me as a pawn in their sick genetic chess game since the day we met. My name is Lauren Jonas, and this is the story of how I discovered that my picture-perfect marriage was actually an elaborate 15-year experiment in social engineering, genetic manipulation, and old money desperation. What started as a fairy tale romance between a scholarship kid from Detroit and a Princeton legacy heir turned into the most twisted family conspiracy you could imagine. The Holbrooks weren't just wealthy, they were Connecticut royalty, old shipping money that had been passed down through 7 generations, each more obsessed with bloodlines and genetic superiority than the last. When I married Pete Holbrook 5 years ago, I thought I was joining a family. What I actually joined was a breeding program. See, Pete's mother, Sophia Holbrook, had been planning my entire relationship with her son since before I even knew he existed. From my scholarship to Princeton, which her foundation funded, to our chance meeting at the campus library, to our romantic proposal at their family's private island. Every single moment had been orchestrated. But here's what Sophia didn't count on. I'm not just some naive girl from the wrong side of Detroit who got lucky. I'm a biochemist with a PhD in genetics, and I know how to read a DNA report. More importantly, I know how to trace genetic markers back through family lines. And when I started digging into the Holbrook family tree, I found some very interesting branches that weren't supposed to exist. The pregnant girlfriend Pete brought to Christmas dinner, her name is Elisha Solomon, and she's not just some random woman he met at a conference. She's the daughter of the Holbrooks' former head of security, a man who worked for the family for 30 years and knew all their secrets. A man who died in a very convenient car accident 6 months after Elisha was born. And that baby she's carrying, the one Pete swears is his, well, let's just say the DNA results in that Christmas gift box revealed a family connection that goes much deeper than anyone at that dinner table could have imagined. Because when you're dealing with a family as obsessed with genetic purity as the Holbrooks, sometimes the biggest secrets are hiding in plain sight. This is the story of how a Christmas dinner became a crime scene, how a DNA test became a murder confession, and how I went from being a pawn in their game to being the player who flipped the entire board. By the time dessert was served, I had exposed a conspiracy that went back decades, solved a murder that everyone thought was an accident, and handed a family of sociopaths exactly what they deserved. But before I tell you about the beautiful moment when Sophia Holbrook's perfect mask finally slipped, and she showed her true face to a room full of witnesses, I need to take you back to the beginning. Back to when I was just Lauren Jonas, a brilliant but naive girl from Detroit, who thought she'd won the lottery when she fell in love with a Holbrook. Because the truth is, I had won something, just not what I thought. I'd won a starring role in a psychological experiment that had been 15 years in the making. An experiment designed to create the perfect Holbrook heir, no matter what laws had to be broken, or whose lives had to be destroyed in the process. And when you're dealing with people who think their bloodline makes them above the law, sometimes the only justice comes from using their own weapons against them. Sometimes the only way to beat the system is to understand it better than the people who created it. So buckle up, because this story has more twists than a DNA double helix, more betrayals than a soap opera, and an ending that proves that sometimes the best revenge isn't getting mad, it's getting a PhD in genetics and using it to expose every dirty secret your in-laws have been hiding for decades. By the time I was done with them, the Holbrook name went from being synonymous with prestige to being synonymous with criminal conspiracy. And it all started with a Christmas gift that contained 15 years' worth of lies, wrapped up in a bow. Let me tell you exactly how I served them justice for Christmas dinner. The phone call that started unraveling everything came at 11:47 p.m. on a Tuesday in November. I was in my home lab, analyzing protein sequences for my consulting work, when Pete's phone lit up on the kitchen counter. He was in the shower, and normally I wouldn't even glance at his messages. But this one made my blood freeze. The contact name was just E, but it was the message preview that stopped me cold. Doctor confirmed everything is perfect. Baby is healthy and developing exactly as planned. 22 weeks now. We need to discuss the Christmas timeline. 22 weeks pregnant. I did the math instantly. That put conception right around late June. The same week Pete had gone to that mysterious genetics conference in Boston that I could never find any record of online. The same week he'd come home acting strange, distant, like he was carrying some enormous secret. I heard the shower turn off upstairs. My hands were shaking as I quickly screenshotted the message and deleted it from his notification. When Pete came downstairs 20 minutes later, hair still damp, reaching for his phone with that casual motion I'd seen thousands of times, I was back at my computer, analyzing proteins like nothing had happened. I thought I heard my phone buzz, he said, checking his screen with a confused expression. Probably just a spam call. You know how they are at night, I replied without looking up from my screen. Pete shrugged and kissed my forehead absently. Don't stay up too late with the lab work, babe. You've been pushing yourself hard lately. The irony of him telling me not to push myself hard while he was apparently managing a pregnant girlfriend wasn't lost on me. But I just smiled and nodded. The perfect supportive wife. Inside, my mind was already racing through possibilities, each one worse than the last. That night, I lay awake staring at the ceiling, listening to Pete's steady breathing beside me. 5 years of marriage, and I thought I knew everything about this man. We'd built a life together, our beautiful house in Princeton, my consulting business, his work at the family investment firm. We'd been trying for a baby for 2 years with no success. My doctor said there was nothing wrong with either of us, just timing issues. Now I was wondering if those timing issues had been deliberately orchestrated. Because here's the thing about the Holbrook family, nothing in their world happens by accident. Every social introduction, every business deal, every marriage alliance is carefully planned. I'd always assumed I was the exception, the random variable that Pete had fallen for despite their preferences. But lying there in the dark, replaying years of subtle comments and strange interactions, I started to see a different pattern. Sophia's initial resistance to our relationship that mysteriously melted away after she learned about my genetics PhD. The family's sudden enthusiasm for our marriage once they discovered my family's medical history, 3 generations of women who lived past 90 with no major genetic disorders. The next morning, I did something I'd never done before. I started investigating my own husband. Not because I wanted to catch him cheating. Infidelity was almost the least of my concerns at this point. I started investigating because I suspected something much darker was happening, something that went beyond a simple affair. I started with the Boston trip. Pete had said it was a genetics conference, but when I searched every major genetics conference in Boston for late June, nothing matched his dates. Then I tried medical conferences, pharmaceutical conferences, even general science conferences. Nothing. It was like the conference he'd attended simply didn't exist. Next, I checked his credit card statements from that week. The charges told a disturbing story. A 5-star hotel in downtown Boston, yes, but also charges at a private medical clinic I'd never heard of, Meridian Reproductive Sciences, dinner at an expensive restaurant for 2 people, and most unsettling of all, a charge at a jewelry store for $3,847. I called the medical clinic pretending to be following up on insurance coverage for a consultation. The receptionist was helpful but confused. We don't typically handle insurance directly, ma'am. Most of our clients pay privately for our specialized fertility services. Are you sure your husband consulted with us about his wife's treatment? My blood turned to ice. His wife's treatment? Well, yes. Our records show Peter Holbrook consulted about fertility options for his wife. Though I see here the consultation was specifically about genetic compatibility and selective implantation procedures. Very advanced reproductive planning. I hung up the phone, my hands trembling. Selective implantation procedures. Genetic compatibility. They'd been planning to help Pete have a baby, just not with me. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. The jewelry store charge was easier to track down. A quick call revealed that Pete had purchased an engagement ring. Not a wedding band, not a gift for his existing wife. An engagement ring, sized for someone with much smaller fingers than mine. I spent the rest of that day in my lab, not working on protein sequences, but analyzing the data I'd gathered like it was a scientific experiment. Because that's exactly what this felt like. A carefully controlled experiment where I was the unwitting test subject. By evening, I had a working hypothesis that made my stomach churn. Pete hadn't been having a simple affair. He'd been conducting a parallel relationship, possibly for years, with someone the family had carefully selected and prepared. Someone they viewed as a better genetic match for continuing the Holbrook bloodline. But why keep me around? Why maintain our marriage while pursuing this other relationship? The answer came to me as I was reviewing my own family's medical history, the same records I'd provided to the Holbrooks during our engagement. I wasn't just Pete's wife, I was his genetic insurance policy. My family's remarkable health and longevity genes made me valuable breeding stock in their eyes. But if this other woman could provide something even better, perhaps a more controlled genetic outcome, then I was expendable. The thought should have devastated me. Instead, it crystallized my resolve. Because if the Holbrooks wanted to play genetic chess with people's lives, they'd picked the wrong opponent. I hadn't just studied genetics, I'd mastered it. And I was about to show them exactly what happens when you underestimate someone with a PhD in molecular biology and access to the most advanced genetic testing equipment money could buy. I looked at Pete's phone again, waiting for another message from E. When it came, I was ready. Before I tell you how I unraveled the Holbrook conspiracy, you need to understand where I came from. Because the contrast between my world and theirs wasn't just about money, it was about two completely different philosophies of human worth. I grew up in Highland Park, Detroit, in a neighborhood where the houses were small, but the dreams were enormous. My mother, Patricia Jonas, worked 3 jobs to keep us afloat after my father left when I was 8. She cleaned offices at night, worked retail during the day, and did bookkeeping for local businesses on weekends. I rarely saw her except for the 20 minutes each morning, when she'd make me breakfast before heading to her first shift. Our house was 800 square feet with paper-thin walls, and a furnace that only worked when it felt like it. But it was also where I learned that intelligence was the only currency that couldn't be stolen from you. My mother had been pre-med before she got pregnant with me at 19. She never finished her degree, but she made sure I understood that education was the ladder out of our circumstances. "Lauren, baby," she'd tell me while helping with homework at our tiny kitchen table, "your brain is the one thing that makes you equal to anyone. Don't you ever let anyone convince you otherwise." I tested into the gifted program in 3rd grade and never looked back. While other kids were playing video games, I was reading college-level biology textbooks I'd borrowed from the public library. By high school, I was taking advanced chemistry and physics courses at Wayne State University through a dual enrollment program. My guidance counselor said I was the smartest student she'd seen in 20 years, but being smart in Highland Park and being smart enough for Princeton were 2 different things. The scholarship application required essays, recommendations, and an interview that I knew would expose every gap in my cultural education. I'd never been to a museum, never attended a classical music concert, never traveled outside of Michigan. How could I compete with kids who'd been groomed for Ivy League admissions since birth? The Holbrook Foundation's scholarship changed everything. It wasn't just tuition. It covered room, board, books, and even provided a stipend for enrichment activities. When I got the acceptance letter, my mother cried for the first time since my father left. We both knew it was my ticket to a completely different life. What we didn't know was that I hadn't won the scholarship through merit alone. Years later, I'd discover that Sophia Holbrook had been tracking promising students from working-class backgrounds for decades, looking for specific genetic markers and intellectual capabilities. My application had triggered every algorithm they'd designed. My first day at Princeton was like landing on an alien planet. Kids my age were wearing clothes that cost more than my mother's monthly salary, casually discussing their family's vacation homes in the Hamptons, and treating $1,000 textbooks like disposable items. I felt like I was wearing a sign that said "Scholarship Kid from Detroit" in neon letters. I threw myself into my studies with an intensity that bordered on obsession. While my classmates were pledging sororities and attending social events, I was in the laboratory 16 hours a day. Biochemistry became my sanctuary, the one place where my background didn't matter, where data and results spoke louder than trust funds and family connections. That's where I first noticed Pete Holbrook. He was in my organic chemistry class, supposedly struggling with the material, though I later realized his struggles were carefully orchestrated. He'd approach me after class with questions that were just sophisticated enough to show he wasn't stupid, but simple enough to require tutoring. "I don't understand how you make this look so easy," he'd say, those clear blue eyes focused on my face with an intensity that made my heart race. "Would you mind explaining the reaction mechanisms again?" Pete was everything I'd never dared to dream about. Tall, athletic, with the kind of casual confidence that comes from never doubting your place in the world. His family's name was on buildings across campus: the Holbrook Center for Advanced Studies, the Holbrook Memorial Library. But he treated me like I belonged there just as much as he did. Our first real conversation happened during a late-night study session in the library. I was exhausted, frustrated with a particularly complex protein synthesis problem, when Pete slid into the chair across from me. "You look like you could use some coffee," he said, producing 2 cups from the campus cafe. "And maybe some non-academic conversation." We talked until the library closed at 2 a.m., not about chemistry or coursework, but about books, movies, dreams. Pete wanted to write novels, though his family expected him to join their investment firm after graduation. I told him about my mother, about growing up in Detroit, about my plans to revolutionize genetic medicine. "You know what I love about you," he said, as we walked back to the dorms under a sky full of stars. "You see possibilities everywhere. Most people just see obstacles." I fell for him gradually, then all at once. Pete had a way of making me feel like the most fascinating person in any room. He'd ask about my research with genuine interest, celebrate my academic achievements like they were his own victories, and introduce me to his friends without any trace of embarrassment about my background. When he brought me home to meet his family during our junior year, I was terrified. The Holbrook estate in Greenwich, Connecticut, was more like a museum than a house. 37 rooms, original artwork worth millions, and a dining room table that could seat 20 people comfortably. Sophia Holbrook was exactly what I'd expected: elegant, intimidating, with the kind of beauty that comes from generations of careful breeding and unlimited resources. But her reaction to me was surprising. Instead of the ice-cold reception I'd braced for, she seemed genuinely intrigued. "Lauren dear," she said, during our first dinner together, "Pete tells me you're studying biochemistry. How fascinating. We've always believed that scientific advancement is the key to humanity's future." She asked detailed questions about my research, my family's medical history, my career plans. At the time I thought she was just being polite. Now I realize she was conducting an interview for a position I didn't even know I was applying for. The Holbrook family's wealth wasn't just old money, it was old money with a mission. They saw themselves as shepherds of human genetic potential, using their resources to influence everything from university research to reproductive medicine. They funded scholarships, research grants, and medical facilities, all designed to advance their vision of genetic optimization. I thought I was the lucky girl who'd caught the prince's eye. In reality, I was the carefully selected candidate who'd passed their genetic screening process with flying colors. But I wouldn't understand any of that until much later, when I was lying awake in my marriage bed, holding a screenshot of a text message that would begin to unravel 15 years of careful manipulation. The girl from Highland Park who'd won a scholarship to Princeton was about to discover that some prizes come with strings attached, and sometimes those strings are thick enough to hang you with. Our courtship felt like something out of a fairy tale, which should have been my first warning sign. Real love is messy, complicated, full of awkward moments and genuine surprises. What Pete and I had was too perfect, too scripted, like someone had written our romance according to a formula designed to make me fall as hard and fast as possible. It started with those tutoring sessions in the chemistry lab. Pete would show up exactly 15 minutes after class ended, always carrying coffee, and always asking questions that were just challenging enough to require extended explanations. His learning style seemed to require a lot of eye contact and accidental hand brushes when reaching for the same textbook. "I think better when you explain things," he'd say, moving his chair closer to mine. "Something about your voice just makes complex concepts click for me." I was 20 years old and had never had a serious boyfriend. The boys from my neighborhood either saw me as too serious, too focused on school to be fun. The boys at Princeton saw me as too different, too obviously scholarship-funded to fit into their social circles. Pete was the first person who seemed to see me as exactly right. Our first official date happened 3 weeks into the tutoring arrangement. Pete had finally mastered reaction mechanisms well enough to ace his midterm, and he insisted on celebrating by taking me to dinner off campus. "I know this little place in Princeton Village," he said, his smile lighting up his entire face. "Nothing fancy, just really good food and the kind of atmosphere where we can actually hear each other talk." The restaurant was perfect, intimate without being intimidating, expensive enough to feel special but not so fancy that I felt underdressed. Pete had clearly thought about what would make me comfortable, which touched me more than if he'd taken me to the most exclusive place in town. Over dinner, I learned that Pete Holbrook was nothing like what I'd expected from a trust fund kid. He was majoring in English literature against his family's wishes, dreaming of writing the great American novel, while his mother pressured him to join the family investment firm. He volunteered at a literacy center in Trenton, teaching adults how to read. He donated most of his allowance to scholarship funds for underprivileged students. "I know what it looks like," he said, when I expressed surprise at his volunteer work. "Rich boy trying to ease his guilt about being born lucky. But the truth is, I see what my family's money can do when it's used right. Education changes everything. Look at you, you're going to revolutionize medicine someday, and it all started with the right opportunity." He asked about my research with the kind of genuine interest I'd never experienced before. Most people's eyes glazed over when I started talking about protein structures and genetic sequences. Pete leaned in, asked follow-up questions, made connections I hadn't even considered. "So if you can identify the genetic markers that predict certain diseases," he said, "you could theoretically develop treatments before symptoms even appear." Exactly, preventive medicine at the molecular level. Instead of treating cancer, we could prevent it from ever developing in people with genetic predispositions. "That's incredible, you're going to save millions of lives someday." The way he looked at me when he said that, like I was already the woman who'd changed the world, made me feel more powerful and valued than any academic achievement ever had. Our relationship developed with a natural rhythm that felt effortless. Study dates in the library that turned into long conversations about everything from politics to philosophy. Weekend trips to New York City, where Pete would show me museums and galleries I'd only read about. Quiet evenings in his dorm room, where he'd read me passages from the novel he was working on while I analyzed lab results. Pete had a way of making ordinary moments feel significant. He'd bring me coffee during late-night lab sessions, not to interrupt my work but just to make sure I was taking care of myself. He'd leave little notes in my textbooks, quotes from poets I'd never heard of, or simple messages like "brilliant mind, beautiful heart." He remembered everything I told him, from my mother's birthday to my favorite childhood book. 6 months into our relationship, Pete brought me home for a weekend. I'd been dreading meeting his family, convinced they'd see right through me to the girl who bought her clothes at Target and had never owned anything that required dry cleaning. The Holbrook estate was everything I'd imagined and worse. The circular driveway alone was bigger than my entire neighborhood block in Detroit. The house looked like something from a movie about European royalty, all stone facades and ivy-covered walls and windows that probably cost more than my mother's annual salary. Sophia Holbrook greeted us at the front door, and I was immediately struck by how much Pete resembled her. The same clear blue eyes, the same elegant bone structure, the same way of holding themselves like they owned whatever space they occupied. But where Pete's confidence felt inclusive, hers felt evaluative. "Lauren," she said, extending a perfectly manicured hand. "What a pleasure to finally meet the girl who's captured my son's attention so completely." The weekend was a masterclass in subtle interrogation disguised as gracious hospitality. Sophia asked about my family, my background, my academic achievements, my future plans. But her questions went deeper than polite interest. She wanted to know about my grandparents' health, my parents' longevity, any family history of genetic disorders. "We believe in the importance of understanding family medical history," she explained when I commented on the thoroughness of her questions. "The Holbrooks have always been advocates for genetic research and preventive medicine. It's fascinating to meet someone who shares those interests professionally." She showed me through their home library, which contained an extensive collection of medical and scientific texts alongside the expected classics. The genetics section was particularly impressive. First editions of Darwin, Watson and Crick's original papers on DNA structure, even some unpublished research from contemporary scientists. "Pete tells me you're interested in genetic medicine," Sophia said, pulling a leather-bound journal from the shelf. "This might interest you. It's my great-grandfather's research notes from the 1920s. He was quite ahead of his time in understanding hereditary traits. I spent hours reading through the journal, fascinated by the early genetic research. What I didn't realize at the time was that the Holbrook family's interest in genetics went far beyond academic curiosity. They'd been tracking and documenting bloodlines for generations, not just their own but anyone who might prove useful to their long-term genetic planning. That Sunday morning, as Pete and I prepared to drive back to campus, Sophia pulled me aside for a private conversation. "Lauren dear," she said, her tone warm but somehow calculating, "I want you to know how pleased we are that Pete has found someone of your caliber. Intelligence and character are the only true measures of worth, don't you think? Background and money are just temporary circumstances." At the time, I thought she was being remarkably open-minded for someone of her social standing. Now I realize she was telling me exactly what I wanted to hear, while simultaneously conducting the final phase of my evaluation. The drive back to Princeton felt like floating on air. Pete held my hand as he drove, occasionally bringing it to his lips for gentle kisses. "I love you," he said, as we pulled into the campus parking lot. Simple words, but the way he said them felt like a promise of forever. "I love you too," I replied, and meant it with every fiber of my being. I thought I was the luckiest girl in the world. I had no idea I was actually the most carefully selected. After graduation, Pete and I moved to Princeton proper, while he started his master's program in creative writing, and I began my PhD in biochemistry. Living together felt like the natural next step, but it also meant deeper integration into the Holbrook world, a world with rules I didn't understand and expectations I couldn't anticipate. The first challenge came with something as simple as dinner parties. Sophia insisted on hosting monthly gatherings for family and close friends, which meant I found myself sitting at tables with people whose names appeared on hospital wings and university buildings. The conversations flowed effortlessly between topics I knew nothing about: art auctions, charity galas, mutual acquaintances from exclusive private schools. "Lauren darling," Sophia would say, her voice warm but her eyes watchful, "you must tell everyone about your fascinating research. We're all so impressed by your academic achievements." I'd launch into an explanation of my work on genetic markers for autoimmune diseases, watching faces around the table struggle to maintain polite interest. These people were accustomed to success, but academic success felt foreign to them. Their achievements were measured in social influence and financial returns, not peer-reviewed publications. The worst part wasn't their disinterest, it was their attempts to be encouraging that felt patronizing. "How wonderful that you're so passionate about your studies," said Margaret Harlan, wife of a federal judge. "Of course, once you and Pete marry and start a family, you'll probably want to focus on more practical pursuits." Pete would jump to my defense immediately. "Lauren's going to revolutionize preventive medicine. Her work is going to save countless lives." But I could see the subtle exchanges of glances, the polite smiles that didn't reach their eyes. To them I was Pete's interesting phase, the brilliant girl he'd eventually outgrow in favor of someone more suitable. The clothing was another minefield. I'd grown up shopping at discount stores, and had developed what I thought was a decent sense of style. But apparently there was a difference between looking good and looking appropriate for the Holbrook social circle. "Lauren dear," Sophia said one afternoon, as we prepared for a charity luncheon, "I hope you don't mind, but I took the liberty of having my personal shopper select a few things for you, just until you have time to develop your wardrobe properly." The clothes were beautiful, designer pieces that fit perfectly and cost more than I'd spent on clothing in my entire life. But wearing them felt like putting on a costume, like playing dress-up in someone else's life. "You look stunning," Pete assured me as we drove to the luncheon. "Though honestly, you'd look beautiful in anything." The problem wasn't whether I looked beautiful. The problem was that I felt like I was disappearing beneath layers of silk and social expectations. The charity events were the most challenging aspect of Holbrook life. These people treated philanthropy like a competitive sport, with complex hierarchies based on donation amounts and board positions. I'd grown up thinking charity meant putting coins in the Salvation Army bucket at Christmas. Here, charity meant galas with $1,000 per plate dinners and silent auctions, where people bid casually on vacation packages that cost more than my mother's annual income. "The key," explained Sophia during one of her informal etiquette lessons, "is understanding that these events aren't really about the money raised. They're about maintaining relationships and demonstrating commitment to the community." I tried to participate appropriately, but every interaction felt like a test I hadn't studied for. When someone mentioned their recent trip to their house in Aspen, was I supposed to ask about the skiing or compliment them on their tan? When they discussed their children's private school applications, should I share stories about my public school experience, or remain diplomatically silent? Pete seemed oblivious to my struggles. He moved through these social situations with the ease of someone who'd been trained for them since birth. He knew which fork to use, which topics were appropriate for which settings, how to make small talk that revealed nothing while appearing to share everything. "You're overthinking it," he'd tell me when I expressed frustration. "These people like you, they're just not used to someone as accomplished as you are." But I could feel their assessment in every interaction. They were waiting for me to prove myself worthy of their acceptance, while I was increasingly unsure I wanted what they were offering. The breaking point came during a weekend at the family's compound in Martha's Vineyard. I'd been looking forward to the trip, imagining romantic walks on the beach, and quiet time with Pete away from the social pressures of Connecticut. Instead, I found myself in a house full of Holbrook relatives and family friends, all determined to include me in activities I had no idea how to navigate. Sailing lessons where I was supposed to understand complex wind patterns and rope configurations. Tennis matches, where my public court experience was woefully inadequate for their grass courts and strategic gameplay. Wine tastings where I was expected to identify subtle flavor notes in bottles that cost more than my monthly stipend. "Lauren seems a bit overwhelmed," I overheard Sophia saying to Pete's aunt during what I thought was a private conversation on the terrace. "Perhaps we're moving too quickly with her." Integration. The word integration stuck with me. It suggested I was being processed, systematically incorporated into their world according to some predetermined plan. It made me feel less like Pete's girlfriend and more like a project they were all working on together. That night, as Pete and I walked along the beach under a sky full of stars, I tried to articulate my growing discomfort. "I feel like I'm losing myself," I told him, "like I'm becoming someone else to fit into your world." Pete stopped walking and turned to face me, his expression serious in the moonlight. "You're not losing yourself, you're just expanding, growing into the person you were always meant to be. But what if I like who I was before? What if I don't want to expand in the directions your family thinks I should?" He pulled me close, his arms warm around me in the cool ocean breeze. "Then we'll figure it out together, you and me against the world, remember?" I wanted to believe him. I wanted to trust that our love was strong enough to bridge any cultural divide. But standing there on the beach, surrounded by the symbols of a wealth and privilege I'd never fully understand, I felt the first stirrings of a fear that would eventually prove prophetic. Maybe I wasn't being integrated into Pete's world at all. Maybe I was being absorbed by it, slowly and systematically, until there would be nothing left of the original Lauren Jonas except her DNA. The proposal came on a perfect October evening during our 4th year together, exactly as I'd fantasized it would happen. Pete had planned a romantic dinner at the restaurant where we'd had our first date, followed by a walk through Princeton's campus under the golden autumn leaves. When he dropped to one knee beside the library where we'd first really talked, producing a ring that caught the lamplight like captured starfire, I thought my heart might burst from happiness. "Lauren Jonas," he said, his voice trembling with emotion, "you are the most brilliant, beautiful, extraordinary woman I've ever known. You make me want to be a better man every single day. Will you marry me?" The ring was perfect, an elegant solitaire that managed to be both stunning and tasteful, exactly what I would have chosen if I'd had unlimited resources and impeccable taste. Later, I'd wonder how Pete had known my exact preferences when we'd never discussed engagement rings. At the time I was too overwhelmed with joy to question anything. "Yes," I whispered, then louder, "Yes, of course, yes." The wedding planning began immediately, and with it came a level of involvement from Sophia that should have concerned me. She insisted on hosting an engagement party at the estate, inviting what felt like half of Connecticut's social elite to celebrate our union. "This is such an important moment for the family," she explained, when I suggested something smaller and more intimate. "Pete is the heir to the Holbrook legacy. His marriage should reflect the significance of that responsibility." The engagement party was a lavish affair that made me feel more like an exhibit than a guest of honor. I stood beside Pete in another perfectly selected designer dress, accepting congratulations from people whose names I struggled to remember, smiling until my face ached. But it was during the speeches that I first noticed something troubling. Instead of the typical stories about Pete's bachelor days, or jokes about losing him to marriage, the toasts focused heavily on our future children. "To Pete and Lauren," declared his uncle Arnold, raising his champagne glass, "and to the brilliant children they'll undoubtedly produce. The next generation of Holbrooks will certainly benefit from Lauren's remarkable intellect." Another family friend, Nicholas Harlan, added, "Such excellent genetic combinations rarely occur naturally. You two are practically designed for each other." I laughed along with everyone else, but the comments stuck with me. Who talked about genetic combinations at an engagement party? Why was everyone so focused on our hypothetical children rather than our actual relationship? The wedding planning process revealed more of Sophia's controlling nature. She had opinions about everything: the venue, the flowers, the menu, even my dress. When I expressed interest in a simple ceremony followed by a casual reception, she looked genuinely horrified. "Darling, this isn't just your wedding," she said, with the patience of someone explaining basic math to a child. "This is a Holbrook family wedding. There are traditions to maintain, expectations to meet. The guest list alone requires certain considerations." I found myself agreeing to decisions that felt increasingly foreign to my vision of our special day. A formal ceremony at the historic church where 5 generations of Holbrooks had married. A reception for 300 guests at the country club. A honeymoon in Switzerland at the family's private chalet. "Is this what you want?" I asked Pete one evening, as we reviewed seating charts that looked more complex than my molecular diagrams. "I want whatever makes you happy," he replied, pulling me close. "But I also want to honor my family's traditions. This wedding is important to them, and they're important to me." The most unsettling moment came during my dress fitting. Sophia had insisted on accompanying me, claiming she wanted to help select accessories that would complement the family's heirloom jewelry. "You know, dear," she said, as the seamstress pinned my hem, "I've been thinking about your health insurance coverage. Once you're married, you'll be on the family's private medical plan. It includes comprehensive genetic counseling and family planning services." "That's generous, but I'm happy with my current coverage." "Oh, but this is so much more thorough. Complete genetic screening, fertility optimization, even preconception health planning. We believe in being proactive about these things." I was too focused on the wedding details to pay much attention to what she was really suggesting. Genetic screening and fertility optimization sounded like routine medical care, not the intensive biological monitoring I'd later discover it actually involved. The wedding itself was everything Sophia had envisioned: elegant, traditional, perfectly orchestrated. I felt beautiful in my designer gown, surrounded by flowers that cost more than my mother's monthly rent, exchanging vows in front of people who represented generations of American high society. But as I looked out at the congregation during the ceremony, I realized I knew fewer than 20% of the guests. This was supposed to be the most important day of my life, but it felt more like a performance for an audience I'd never chosen. Pete's vows were beautiful and heartfelt, promising to love and cherish me forever, to support my dreams and build a future together based on mutual respect and partnership. When he slipped the wedding band onto my finger, I believed completely in our happy ending. The reception was flawless in execution but overwhelming in scope. I spent the evening being introduced to distant relatives and family friends, each conversation blending into the next until I felt like I was on autopilot, smiling and thanking people for coming while my mind struggled to process the enormity of what I'd just committed to. During our first dance, Pete whispered in my ear, "How does it feel to be Mrs. Holbrook?" "Surreal," I answered honestly. "Like I'm playing a role in someone else's life." "You'll get used to it," he said, spinning me gently. "We all do." Something about that phrase, "we all do," sent a chill through me despite the warmth of his arms. It suggested that feeling disconnected from your own life was a normal part of being a Holbrook, an expected adjustment rather than a temporary disorientation. Our honeymoon in Switzerland was beautiful but strange. The family chalet was more like a luxury hotel than a romantic retreat, complete with staff who seemed to anticipate our every need before we knew we had them. Everything was arranged, planned, optimized for maximum comfort and minimum spontaneity. "Doesn't it bother you?" I asked Pete as we sat on the terrace overlooking the Alps, sipping wine that someone else had selected for us. "Doesn't what bother me? Never having to make decisions. Never wondering what might happen next because everything is already planned." Pete considered this seriously, his gaze fixed on the mountain peaks. "I suppose I've never known anything else. This is just how our family operates, efficiently, thoughtfully, with attention to long-term outcomes." Long-term outcomes, even our honeymoon was apparently part of some larger strategic plan. When we returned home as newlyweds, I threw myself into my research with renewed intensity, partly because I loved the work, and partly because it was the one area of my life that still felt entirely my own. But even that sense of autonomy was about to be challenged in ways I couldn't imagine. The first sign came in the form of a routine medical appointment that Sophia insisted I schedule as part of my new health coverage. Just a comprehensive physical, she assured me, to establish baseline health metrics for our family planning. I had no idea that appointment would mark the beginning of the most invasive and systematic monitoring of my biological functions that I could never have conceived possible. The changes in Pete began so subtly that I almost missed them. After 2 years of marriage, I thought I knew his patterns as well as I knew my own research protocols. He woke up at 6:30 every morning, checked his phone while drinking coffee, kissed me goodbye at exactly 7:45. He worked late on Thursdays, called his mother every Sunday afternoon, and fell asleep reading financial reports in bed. But gradually, those patterns started shifting. The morning phone checks became longer, more secretive. He'd take his coffee to his study and close the door, emerging 20 minutes later with an expression I couldn't quite read. When I asked about work or his day, his answers became vague, filled with generic responses that told me nothing. "How was the Peterson account meeting?" I'd ask over dinner. "Fine. Productive. Just the usual portfolio discussions." Pete had never been secretive about his work before. He'd complain about difficult clients, celebrate successful investments, share interesting market insights. Now, his professional life seemed to exist behind a wall I wasn't allowed to approach. The phone calls became the most obvious sign something was wrong. They started around our second anniversary, quick, whispered conversations that ended abruptly whenever I entered the room. Pete would claim they were work calls, but they happened at odd hours. 10 p.m. on a Sunday, 6 a.m. on a Saturday, 3 in the afternoon during his lunch break when he was supposedly eating with colleagues. "Sorry honey, just wrapping up some urgent business," he'd say, sliding the phone into his pocket with movements that seemed too careful, too deliberate. I tried to convince myself I was being paranoid. Pete worked in investment management, a field where urgent calls and confidential conversations were normal. But my scientific training had taught me to pay attention to patterns, and the pattern here was troubling. The biggest change was in how he touched me. We'd always been physically affectionate, casual touches throughout the day, spontaneous kisses, the kind of unconscious intimacy that develops between couples who are completely comfortable with each other. But Pete started approaching physical contact like he was fulfilling an obligation rather than expressing genuine desire. Our sex life, which had always been passionate and frequent, became mechanical. Pete would initiate intimacy with the same scheduled precision he applied to everything else in his life, but his attention seemed elsewhere even during our most intimate moments. He'd hold me afterward, but I could feel his mind racing, focused on something that had nothing to do with me. "Are you okay?" I asked one night after a particularly disconnected encounter. "You seem distant lately." "Just stressed about work," he replied, already reaching for his phone to check messages. "Nothing for you to worry about." But I was worried. The man I'd married was disappearing, being replaced by someone who looked like Pete, sounded like Pete, but felt like a stranger wearing my husband's life. The mysterious trips became more frequent around our third anniversary. Pete had always traveled occasionally for business, but these new trips followed no pattern I could understand. Weekend conferences that I couldn't find online. Client meetings in cities where his firm had no obvious business interests. Emergency situations that required immediate travel but were never mentioned again once he returned. "Boston again?" I asked, reviewing his calendar one Thursday morning. "Complex client situation. Might need to extend through the weekend." "What kind of situation?" Pete's hesitation was barely perceptible, but I caught it. "Merger negotiations. Very confidential. You know how these things are." I didn't know how these things were, because Pete had never been secretive about his work before. Even when dealing with confidential client information, he'd been able to share general details about what was keeping him busy. The worst part was how he'd return from these trips. Pete would come home acting like he'd been rejuvenated by some kind of spiritual experience. He'd be more attentive, more romantic, more like the man I'd originally fallen in love with. For a few days, our marriage would feel normal again. Then, gradually, the distance would creep back in until the next mysterious trip reset the cycle. I started documenting the pattern without consciously deciding to investigate. My scientific background made me automatically track data that seemed significant. Pete's mood cycles correlated perfectly with his travel schedule. His phone usage spiked during certain hours. His interest in family planning conversations increased dramatically after he returned from Boston. "Have you given any more thought to what we discussed about starting a family?" He'd ask during those post-trip periods of renewed attention. We'd been trying to conceive for over a year with no success. My doctor had run every test imaginable, and found nothing wrong with either of us. "Sometimes these things just take time," she'd assured me. Many couples try for years before conceiving naturally, but Pete's questions about pregnancy became more specific, more clinical. He wanted to know about my cycle timing, my diet, my vitamin supplements. He suggested we consult with a fertility specialist, despite my doctor's assurance that we were both healthy and young enough to keep trying naturally. "Maybe we should be more strategic about this," he said one evening, showing me articles he'd printed about fertility optimization. "There are ways to improve our chances significantly." The articles were all from medical journals I'd never heard of, published by research institutions that seemed more focused on genetic optimization than traditional fertility medicine. They discussed concepts like selective conception timing and genetic compatibility maximization, terminology that sounded more like eugenics than family planning. "Where did you find these?" I asked, scanning the author's credentials. "Research department at work. They have access to a lot of medical databases for health insurance planning." It was a reasonable explanation, but something about Pete's tone suggested he was being careful about how much information he shared. I began to suspect that his sudden interest in fertility science had very little to do with our desire to have children and everything to do with something else entirely. The final confirmation that something was seriously wrong came during what should have been a routine dinner with his family. We were at the estate for Sunday dinner, discussing holiday plans, when Sophia made a comment that stopped me cold. "Lauren, dear, how are you feeling about the new vitamin regimen?" Dr. Mitchell said, "You should be seeing improvements in your energy levels by now." I stared at her blankly. What vitamin regimen? Who is Dr. Mitchell? Pete's fork clattered against his plate. Sophia's expression shifted from casual interest to something that looked almost like panic. "Oh," she said carefully. "I must have misunderstood. Pete mentioned you were consulting with a nutritionist about optimizing your health for conception." I turned to Pete, whose face had gone pale. "What nutritionist? What vitamins? What is she talking about?" "It's nothing," Pete said quickly. "Just some supplements my doctor recommended. For both of us. General health optimization." But I knew Pete well enough to recognize when he was lying. And I was starting to realize that the changes in his behavior weren't the result of work stress or normal marital adjustment. They were the result of him living a completely separate life that I knew nothing about. A life that somehow involved medical professionals I'd never met, vitamin regimens I'd never agreed to, and health optimization plans that no one had bothered to discuss with me. That night, lying in bed beside my husband, who no longer felt like my husband, I made a decision that would change everything. I was going to find out what Pete was really doing during those mysterious trips to Boston, and I was going to discover exactly why his mother knew more about my supposed medical care than I did. The breakthrough came from an unexpected source, my former college roommate Brittany, who worked as a pharmaceutical sales representative in Boston. We'd maintained a casual friendship after graduation, the kind where we'd catch up every few months over coffee or texts about our respective careers. But when Brittany called me on a Tuesday afternoon in late October, her voice carried an urgency I'd never heard before. "Lauren, I need to ask you something, and please don't think I'm crazy," she said, without preamble. "Are you and Pete having fertility issues?" My blood went cold. "Why would you ask that?" "Because I just saw him leaving the Meridian Reproductive Sciences Clinic in downtown Boston yesterday afternoon. He was with a pregnant woman I didn't recognize, and they were both coming out of what looked like a consultation appointment." The phone slipped in my suddenly sweaty palm. "Are you absolutely sure it was Pete?" "Positive." I called his name, but he either didn't hear me or pretended not to. "Lauren, that clinic specializes in very advanced reproductive medicine, like experimental gene therapy and selective implantation procedures, not the kind of place you go for routine fertility consultation." After hanging up, I sat in my home lab staring at protein sequences that suddenly seemed meaningless. Pete had been in Boston yesterday. I knew because he'd called me from his hotel room to say goodnight. But he'd told me he was there for a portfolio review with pharmaceutical industry clients. That evening, I did something I'd never done in 5 years of marriage. I went through Pete's belongings systematically, looking for evidence of what he was really doing in Boston. In his study, buried beneath a stack of legitimate financial reports, I found a folder marked medical consultations in Pete's handwriting. Inside were documents that made my hands shake as I read them. The first was a consultation summary from Meridian Reproductive Sciences, dated 3 months earlier. The patient names were Pete Holbrook and Elisha Solomon. The consultation type was listed as genetic compatibility assessment and selective conception planning. Elisha Solomon. I'd never heard that name before, but seeing it paired with my husband's in a reproductive medicine context felt like being punched in the stomach. The second document was even more disturbing. It was a genetic analysis report, comparing Pete's DNA markers with those of subject ES, presumably Elisha Solomon. The report included detailed recommendations for optimizing conception timing, genetic expression enhancement, and something called hereditary trait maximization. But the third document was what made me realize the full scope of what I was dealing with. It was a comparative genetic analysis involving 3 subjects, Pete Holbrook, Elisha Solomon, and someone identified only as LJ, my initials. Someone had been analyzing my genetic material without my knowledge or consent. The report compared fertility potential, genetic compatibility scores, and something called offspring optimization probabilities between Pete paired with Elisha versus Pete paired with me. According to the analysis, while I scored higher in longevity genes and disease resistance, Elisha scored significantly higher in what they termed cognitive enhancement potential and physical optimization markers. At the bottom of the report, handwritten in what I recognized as Sophia's elegant script, was a note: proceed with ES timeline. LJ backup protocol remains active pending outcome assessment. I was a backup protocol. My entire marriage was apparently part of some twisted genetic breeding experiment, and I was the insurance policy in case their preferred option didn't work out. I photographed every document with my phone, then carefully returned them to Pete's folder exactly as I'd found them. My scientific training had taught me the importance of preserving evidence while conducting investigation. But I needed more information. I needed to understand how long this had been going on, and exactly who Elisha Solomon was. The next morning, after Pete left for what he claimed was a routine day at the office, I called Meridian Reproductive Sciences directly. "I'm calling to confirm an appointment for my husband Peter Holbrook," I told the receptionist, gambling that direct approach might yield more information than subterfuge. "Of course, Mrs. Holbrook. Are you referring to his appointment next Tuesday with Dr. Chen, or the consultation with Miss Solomon scheduled for Thursday?" "Miss Solomon." So Elisha was a regular participant in whatever medical procedures Pete was undergoing. "The Tuesday appointment," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "Could you remind me of the time?" 2 p.m. for the genetic counseling session. "Will you be joining them this time, or will it just be Mr. Holbrook and Miss Solomon?" The casual way she asked whether I'd be joining them suggested that Pete and Elisha had been attending these appointments together regularly, and that the clinic staff knew I existed but wasn't typically present. "Just confirming the details," I managed to say before hanging up. I spent the rest of that day in my lab, but instead of working on my assigned research, I used the university's database access to investigate Meridian Reproductive Sciences. What I discovered was deeply unsettling. The clinic was privately funded, with its primary financial backing coming from something called the Holbrook Foundation for Genetic Research, the same foundation that had provided my scholarship to Princeton, the same foundation that had been tracking and funding my education for years before I'd ever met Pete. Their published research focused on what they termed directed evolution, using advanced reproductive medicine to enhance specific genetic traits in offspring. Their client base was exclusively ultra-wealthy families who wanted to optimize their bloodlines for intelligence, physical health, and longevity. But the most disturbing discovery came when I cross-referenced their staff directory with academic publications. Dr. Mitchell, the name Sophia had mentioned in connection with my supposed vitamin regimen, was listed as Meridian's Director of Genetic Monitoring. I'd never met Dr. Mitchell, never consented to genetic monitoring, and certainly never agreed to participate in whatever experimental procedures the clinic was conducting. That evening, when Pete returned from his supposedly routine day at the office, I watched him carefully for any signs that he suspected I knew about his secret life. But he seemed completely normal, kissing me hello, asking about my day, suggesting we order takeout from our favorite Thai restaurant. "How was work?" I asked, testing whether he'd volunteer any information about his actual activities. "Busy day. Portfolio reviews, client calls, the usual," he replied without hesitation. He was lying to my face with the same casual ease he'd shown throughout our entire marriage. It made me wonder how many other lies I'd accepted without question, how many times I'd believed his explanations, because I wanted to trust him. As we ate dinner together, Pete talking about weekend plans and holiday preparations, I realized I was sitting across from a stranger. The man I'd thought I knew, the man I'd built my life around, was just a character he'd been playing for my benefit. But what scared me most wasn't Pete's deception. It was the growing certainty that he hadn't been acting alone. The genetic analysis reports, the clinic funding, Sophia's knowledge of medical procedures I'd never agreed to. All of it pointed to a conspiracy that went far beyond one husband's infidelity. The Holbrook family had been orchestrating my life for years, and I was just beginning to understand how deep their manipulation went. That night, as Pete slept peacefully beside me, I stared at the ceiling and planned my next move. I needed to find Elisha Solomon and discover exactly what role she was playing in their genetic chess game. Because if I was going to fight back against people who thought they could engineer human lives like laboratory experiments, I needed to understand the full scope of what I was up against. Finding Elisha Solomon required every investigative skill I'd developed as a researcher, plus some techniques I'd never thought I'd need in my personal life. I started with the basic information from the medical documents, her full name and the fact that she was regularly attending appointments at Meridian Reproductive Sciences. The breakthrough came through social media, though it took me 3 days of systematic searching to find her. Elisha Solomon maintained minimal online presence, but I finally located her through a Princeton alumni directory. She'd graduated 2 years behind Pete and me with a degree in molecular biology, a detail that immediately raised red flags about the random nature of their relationship. Her LinkedIn profile listed her current position as research coordinator at Meridian Reproductive Sciences. She wasn't just Pete's secret girlfriend, she was professionally involved in whatever genetic manipulation the clinic was conducting. This wasn't a simple affair, it was a coordinated scientific endeavor. I spent the next week conducting surveillance that would have impressed a private detective. Using Pete's known schedule and the appointment information I'd gathered, I positioned myself outside Meridian's downtown Boston office on the day of his next consultation. What I witnessed made my blood run cold. Pete arrived at exactly 1:45 p.m., but he wasn't alone. Sophia Holbrook emerged from a black Mercedes sedan behind him, followed by a woman I recognized from her online photos as Elisha Solomon. But Elisha wasn't just Pete's companion, she was visibly pregnant, probably around 6 months based on her profile. They entered the clinic together like a family unit, with Sophia's hand protectively on Elisha's lower back, and Pete carrying what appeared to be medical files. This wasn't a secret affair being hidden from the family. This was a family project being hidden from me. I waited in my car for 2 hours until they emerged. Pete and Elisha appeared relaxed, even happy, while Sophia wore the satisfied expression of someone whose plans were proceeding perfectly. They stood outside the clinic for several minutes, discussing something intensely before Pete pulled Elisha into what looked like an affectionate, intimate embrace. Watching my husband hold another woman's pregnant body with the tenderness he'd never shown me was devastating enough. But seeing his mother orchestrate the entire interaction like a puppet master was what pushed me into action. I followed them at a distance as they drove to an upscale restaurant in Back Bay. Through the window I watched them celebrate over champagne, while Pete and Sophia drank while Elisha sipped what appeared to be sparkling water. They toasted something, laughed frequently, and looked for all the world like excited grandparents to be celebrating with their pregnant daughter-in-law. That evening, Pete returned home with the same casual demeanor he'd maintained throughout our marriage. He kissed me hello, asked about my day, and mentioned that his Boston meeting had gone well. Just routine portfolio stuff, he said, the lie flowing so smoothly I marveled at his practiced deception. Nothing too exciting, but I'd moved beyond being hurt by his lies. Now I was focused on gathering evidence and understanding the full scope of their operation. Over the next 2 weeks, I launched a systematic investigation using resources I had access to through my university position. I started by researching the Holbrook Foundation's funding patterns, tracing their financial support back through decades of academic and medical grants. What I discovered was a pattern of strategic investment in genetic research that painted a disturbing picture of long-term social engineering. The foundation hadn't just funded my Princeton scholarship, they'd funded dozens of scholarships for students with specific genetic profiles, academic achievements, and family medical histories. I found my own file in the university's scholarship database, and the selection criteria were chilling. They hadn't chosen me because I was economically disadvantaged or academically exceptional. They'd chosen me because my family's genetic profile matched specific markers they were targeting: longevity genes, disease resistance, and cognitive enhancement potential. My entire academic career had been sponsored by people who viewed me as breeding stock. But the most shocking discovery came when I traced Elisha Solomon's background. She wasn't just another scholarship recipient, she was the daughter of Thomas Solomon, the Holbrook family's former head of security who died in a car accident when she was 6 months old. Thomas Solomon had worked for the family for 30 years, managing not just their physical security, but also what internal documents referred to as information management. Translation: he'd been responsible for covering up whatever illegal or unethical activities the family was involved in. According to police reports I accessed through academic databases, Thomas's car accident had occurred just days after he'd requested a meeting with the FBI regarding irregularities in genetic research funding and human subject consent protocols. He'd apparently discovered something about the family's genetic manipulation programs that troubled him enough to consider whistleblowing. His death had been ruled accidental, caused by brake failure on a rainy night. But the timing was suspiciously convenient for a family whose entire operation depended on secrecy. Elisha had been raised by her grandmother after her father's death, but her education had been fully funded by anonymous scholarships that I could now trace back to Holbrook Foundation shell companies. They'd been monitoring and supporting her entire life, waiting for the right moment to bring her into their genetic breeding program. But why both of us? Why maintain a marriage with me while pursuing reproduction with Elisha? The answer came from internal Meridian documents I accessed through a combination of legitimate research databases and some ethically questionable hacking using university computer systems. The clinic was conducting what they called parallel optimization protocols, essentially running multiple genetic experiments simultaneously to maximize their chances of producing offspring with desired traits. Elisha's genetic profile made her ideal for producing children with enhanced cognitive abilities and physical optimization. My genetic profile made me ideal for producing children with longevity and disease resistance. Rather than choosing between us, they were planning to use both of us to create a diversified portfolio of genetically enhanced Holbrook heirs. The most nauseating detail was in a memo from Dr. Mitchell outlining conception timing coordination. They were planning to impregnate both Elisha and me within the same time frame, allowing them to compare developmental outcomes and select the most promising genetic combinations for future breeding cycles. We weren't women to them. We were laboratory animals in a multi-generational genetic experiment, but they'd made one crucial mistake in their careful planning. They'd chosen to manipulate a woman with a PhD in genetics, someone who understood their scientific methods well enough to expose them. As I sat in my lab that night, surrounded by evidence of the most elaborate deception I could have imagined, I felt something shift inside me. The hurt and betrayal were still there, but they were being overwhelmed by something much more powerful: cold, scientific rage. These people had murdered a man to protect their secrets. They'd manipulated my entire life from adolescence onward. They'd turned my marriage into a lie and my husband into a co-conspirator in human experimentation. But they'd also given me all the tools I needed to destroy them. I knew their methods, their goals, their weaknesses. I had access to their research, their communication patterns, their illegal activities. Most importantly, I understood something they'd overlooked in their arrogant certainty: the difference between controlling people and underestimating them. They thought they were dealing with a naive girl from Detroit, who'd be grateful for whatever scraps of their world they threw at her. They were about to discover they'd actually been dealing with a brilliant scientist who now had every reason to use her expertise against them. The investigation phase was over. It was time to start planning their destruction. The final piece of evidence that shattered any remaining illusions about my marriage came from the most unlikely source: my own medical records. After discovering the extent of the Holbrook conspiracy, I realized I needed to understand exactly what had been done to me without my knowledge or consent. Using my university credentials, I requested complete copies of all medical records from every healthcare provider I'd used since marrying Pete. What arrived in my email 2 days later was a digital file that contained far more information than I'd ever provided to any doctor. Hidden among routine lab results and physical exam notes were genetic analyses I'd never consented to, hormone level tracking that extended back 3 years, and detailed fertility assessments that included information I'd never discussed with any medical professional. Someone had been systematically monitoring my biological functions since our wedding, analyzing everything from my menstrual cycles, to my stress hormone levels, to my genetic markers for reproductive health. The level of surveillance was so comprehensive that they probably knew more about my body's inner workings than I did. But the most devastating discovery was a series of blood tests that had been conducted during routine medical appointments. Tests I'd been told were for standard health screening, but were actually for something called conception readiness optimization. According to the lab results, I'd been given hormone supplements disguised as vitamins for the past 2 years. The general health optimization supplements Pete had mentioned weren't designed to improve my overall wellness. They were designed to regulate my fertility cycles and enhance the likelihood of conception when the timing was right. They'd been drugging me, systematically, deliberately, without my knowledge or consent. The medical files also revealed something that made my hands shake as I read it: detailed genetic compatibility analyses between my DNA and multiple potential fathers. Not just Pete's genetic profile, but profiles from at least 6 other men, all analyzed for optimal offspring potential when paired with my genetic markers. I wasn't just Pete's wife in their breeding program. I was a genetic resource being evaluated for multiple potential pairings. The names on the compatibility analyses read like a roster of young men from prominent families: Tom Harlan, Nicholas Solomon, Arnold Jonas, all surnames I recognized from the Holbrook social circle. All men who'd been friendly to me at family gatherings in ways that now seemed less like politeness and more like auditions. But the file that made me physically nauseous was labeled Reproductive Timeline Coordination. It outlined a detailed schedule for conception attempts with multiple partners, starting with Pete, but including contingency plans for other genetic pairings if the primary protocol failed to produce desired results. According to their timeline, I was currently in what they termed Phase 1, attempting natural conception with Pete, while monitoring my fertility cycles and optimizing my hormonal environment. If I didn't conceive within 6 months, they planned to move to Phase 2, more aggressive fertility interventions, including possible artificial insemination with genetically selected donors. Phase 3 involved something called direct genetic modification that I didn't want to think about too carefully. They weren't just trying to get me pregnant, they were planning to use my body as an experimental laboratory for genetic engineering, with or without my consent. The most sickening detail was a psychological profile that had been compiled about me, analyzing my personality traits, emotional responses, and likely reactions to various scenarios. They'd been studying me like a laboratory specimen, cataloging my behaviors, and predicting my responses to manipulation. The profile noted that I was highly intelligent but emotionally invested in romantic idealism, and likely to prioritize relationship stability over personal autonomy when faced with evidence of deception. They'd been counting on my love for Pete to keep me compliant, even if I discovered part of their scheme. They'd underestimated me catastrophically, but the discovery that pushed me from devastated victim to coldly furious opponent was buried in a subsection of the psychological profile labeled Elimination Protocols. It outlined procedures for managing the subject if I became uncooperative or posed a threat to their operations. The procedures ranged from psychological manipulation to social isolation, to something euphemistically referred to as permanent solution implementation, language that strongly suggested they were prepared to kill me if I became too much of a problem. Like they'd killed Thomas Solomon when he'd threatened to expose their operations. I sat in my lab that night, surrounded by evidence of the most elaborate and sinister conspiracy I could have imagined, and felt something crystallize inside me. These people had stolen my life, violated my body, manipulated my emotions, and planned my potential murder with the same clinical detachment they applied to their genetic experiments. But they'd made one fundamental error in their careful planning. They'd assumed that discovering their deception would break me, make me desperate to preserve whatever scraps of my marriage I could salvage. Instead, it had freed me. I was no longer Lauren Holbrook, the grateful scholarship girl trying to fit into a world where she didn't belong. I was Dr. Lauren Jonas, a brilliant geneticist with access to cutting-edge laboratory equipment and a complete understanding of their scientific methods. More importantly, I was a woman with nothing left to lose and every reason to destroy them completely. I spent the rest of that night planning their annihilation with the same systematic precision they'd used to plan my exploitation. But where they'd made the mistake of thinking they could control the outcome, I understood something they'd missed in their arrogance. The most dangerous opponent is someone who's been underestimated by people who think they're untouchable. They wanted to play genetic chess with human lives. Fine. But they were about to discover that they'd been playing against someone who understood the game better than they did. And unlike them, I was playing to win. The next morning, I called Pete's office and left a message that I was feeling unwell and would be spending the day resting. Then I drove to a medical supply company and purchased everything I needed to conduct the most comprehensive genetic analysis of my life. Because if the Holbrooks wanted to use DNA as a weapon, I was going to show them exactly how sharp that weapon could be when wielded by someone who truly understood its power. By the time I was finished with them, their family name would be synonymous with the kind of genetic crimes that ended careers, destroyed reputations, and sent people to prison for the rest of their lives. And it would all start with a Christmas gift that would expose every secret they'd spent decades trying to hide. The investigation was over. The preparation phase was about to begin, and the Holbrooks had no idea what was coming for them. The beauty of having a PhD in genetics is that you understand exactly how to weaponize the truth. Over the next 3 weeks, I transformed my home laboratory into a command center for the most methodical takedown of a criminal conspiracy that I could design. My first step was securing irrefutable evidence. I needed documentation that would hold up in court, satisfy federal investigators, and destroy the Holbrooks so completely that they could never harm anyone else. This meant I couldn't just rely on the files I'd already gathered. I needed to create an evidentiary trail that was legally bulletproof. I started by legally obtaining DNA samples from everyone involved. Pete was easy. Years of marriage meant I had access to everything from hair in his hairbrush to saliva on coffee cups. Sophia was more challenging, but her monthly visits to our house provided opportunities to collect genetic material from water glasses and napkins. The real challenge was getting samples from the extended conspiracy, but the Holbrooks' obsession with formal dinner parties turned out to be their weakness. At their Thanksgiving gathering, I discreetly collected genetic material from every guest who'd appeared in those compatibility analyses. A wine glass here, a fork there, collected with the kind of scientific precision that would make the evidence unassailable. Elisha Solomon required a different approach. I couldn't risk direct contact that might alert her to my investigation. Instead, I used her professional connection to Meridian Reproductive Sciences. Posing as a researcher collaborating on a genetics project, I arranged to tour their facilities and meet with their staff. Elisha was friendly and professional during our brief interaction, completely unaware that I was her husband's wife. She proudly showed me through their genetic analysis laboratory, explaining their advanced testing procedures while I surreptitiously collected DNA evidence from equipment she'd handled. More importantly, the facility tour gave me access to their computer systems. While Elisha was explaining their genetic sequencing protocols, I installed a small data gathering device on their network that would give me remote access to their files and communications. The information I extracted over the following week was devastating. Internal communications between Sophia, Pete, Elisha, and Dr. Mitchell revealed the full scope of their conspiracy. Email threads discussing subject monitoring, genetic optimization timelines, and protocol implementation provided a complete record of their criminal activities. But the most damaging evidence was a series of video conferences I was able to access through their compromised network. Recorded meetings where they discussed me like a laboratory specimen, analyzing my behavioral patterns and planning increasingly invasive interventions. The subject remains unaware of hormone supplementation, Dr. Mitchell reported in one particularly nauseating session. Fertility optimization is proceeding on schedule. We should see conception within the next 2 cycles, if the genetic compatibility calculations are accurate. And if natural conception fails, Sophia asked. We move to direct intervention protocols. The subject's psychological profile suggests she'll be compliant if we frame it as medical necessity. Pete's voice was clearly audible in the recording. How long before we need to consider the elimination timeline? Ideally, never, Dr. Mitchell replied. But if the subject becomes uncooperative or poses a security risk, we have protocols in place. The same protocols that proved effective with Thomas Solomon. They'd recorded themselves discussing murder as casually as they might discuss dinner plans. It was the kind of evidence that would guarantee life sentences for everyone involved. But evidence wasn't enough. I needed a platform for exposure that would maximize impact and minimize their ability to cover up or retaliate. After careful consideration, I realized that Christmas dinner at the Holbrook estate was perfect for my purposes. The annual Christmas gathering brought together everyone involved in the conspiracy, plus dozens of witnesses from Connecticut's social elite. Sophia always invited prominent judges, politicians, and business leaders, people whose presence would make it impossible to suppress whatever happened during the evening. More importantly, Pete had already mentioned that he wanted to make a special announcement during this year's dinner. Based on the conspiracy timeline I'd uncovered, I knew exactly what that announcement would be: Elisha's pregnancy and their plans for the future. They were planning to use Christmas dinner to reveal their genetic breeding success to the extended family. I was going to use the same occasion to reveal their crimes to the world. My plan required precise timing and flawless execution. I would attend the dinner as Pete's supportive wife, playing my role perfectly until the moment he made his announcement. Then, when all eyes were on them and their moment of triumph, I would present my Christmas gift to the family. The gift would be elegantly wrapped, containing copies of all the evidence I'd gathered: DNA analyses, recorded conversations, medical files, financial records, and a complete genealogical chart showing the true parentage of Elisha's baby. Because my investigation had revealed one final secret that would destroy them more completely than all their other crimes combined. Elisha's baby wasn't just Pete's child. According to the genetic analysis I'd conducted, Pete wasn't even the father. The DNA markers pointed to someone much closer to home, someone whose paternity would expose a different kind of family conspiracy that went back decades. But I wasn't going to reveal that information until the perfect moment, when maximum damage could be achieved with minimum opportunity for damage control. I spent the final week before Christmas dinner rehearsing my presentation, timing every revelation for maximum psychological impact. I prepared copies of all evidence for immediate distribution to law enforcement, media outlets, and regulatory agencies. I arranged for trusted colleagues to simultaneously release the information if anything happened to me. Most importantly, I contacted Thomas Solomon's elderly mother, Elisha's grandmother, and provided her with evidence of how her son had really died. She deserved to know the truth, and her testimony would be crucial for the murder charges I intended to pursue. The night before Christmas dinner, I sat in my laboratory, surrounded by the evidence that would end the Holbrook conspiracy forever. Everything was ready. The documentation was complete, the distribution plan was in place, and the timing was perfect. Pete came home that evening more excited than I'd seen him in months. "Tomorrow's going to be special," he said, kissing my forehead with what I now recognized as calculated affection. "I think it's going to be the beginning of a whole new chapter for our family." "I'm sure it will be," I replied with a smile that probably looked more predatory than he realized. He had no idea how right he was. Tomorrow would indeed be the beginning of a new chapter, just not the one he was expecting. Tomorrow the Holbrook family's century-long legacy of manipulation and murder was going to end with a Christmas gift they'd never forget. And I was going to give it to them, with all the love they deserved. Christmas Eve at the Holbrook estate was exactly as I remembered from previous years. A masterpiece of orchestrated elegance designed to remind everyone present of the family's wealth, power, and unshakable position in Connecticut society. But this year, I saw it through completely different eyes. The 30-foot Christmas tree in the main foyer was decorated with ornaments that cost more than most people's monthly salaries. Crystal champagne flutes caught the light from chandeliers that had been imported from European palaces. Fresh flowers arranged by the most exclusive florist in Greenwich created centerpieces that would wilt and be discarded within days, their brief beauty another symbol of casual extravagance. Everything was perfect, controlled, designed to impress, just like the family that lived here. "You look beautiful tonight," Pete said, as we walked up the circular driveway, his hand warm on my lower back. I was wearing a deep emerald dress that Sophia had selected for me earlier in the week. Another example of how even my most personal choices were subject to family approval. "Thank you," I replied, adjusting the elegant clutch that contained the most important Christmas gift I'd ever given anyone. The DNA results and evidence files were printed on expensive paper, bound in leather covers that would make them look like the family documents they were about to replace. Inside, the house buzzed with the kind of sophisticated conversation that only happened when Connecticut's power elite gathered in one place. Federal judges chatted with pharmaceutical executives. University presidents exchanged pleasantries with hedge fund managers. State politicians shared cocktails with old money families whose influence reached back generations. Sophia had outdone herself with the guest list. Everyone who mattered in New England society was here, creating the perfect audience for what was about to unfold. "Lauren, darling," Sophia glided toward us in a champagne silk dress that probably cost more than my mother's annual income. "You look lovely. That color is perfect on you." Her smile was warm, genuine, the expression of a woman who believed she'd successfully manipulated everyone around her for decades. She had no idea that her carefully constructed world was about to collapse in the most public way possible. "Thank you for including me in your family traditions," I said, embracing her with what I hoped looked like genuine affection. "This evening is always so special." "Well, this year will be particularly memorable," she replied, her eyes sparkling with anticipation. "Pete has something wonderful to share with everyone." I could see the excitement barely contained beneath her composed exterior. This was the moment she'd been planning for years, the public announcement of her genetic breeding program's success, a revelation that would secure the Holbrook legacy for another generation. Pete guided me through the crowd, introducing me to guests I'd met dozens of times before. I smiled, made appropriate small talk, and played the role of the devoted wife with the kind of performance that would have impressed professional actors. But I was also studying the room, memorizing faces and positions. When the truth came out, I wanted to remember every person who witnessed the Holbrook family's downfall. Some of them would undoubtedly try to distance themselves from the scandal afterward. Others would become crucial witnesses in the criminal proceedings that would follow. The most interesting observation was how many guests seemed to already know about Pete's announcement. Subtle comments and knowing glances suggested that rumors about Elisha's pregnancy had been circulating among their social circle for weeks. This wasn't going to be a surprise revelation, it was going to be a public confirmation of an open secret, which made my actual surprise that much more devastating. "Ladies and gentlemen," Sophia called, tapping her champagne flute with a silver knife. "If I could have your attention for just a moment." The conversation quieted as nearly 60 people turned toward the main fireplace where Sophia stood with the kind of natural authority that came from a lifetime of commanding attention in rooms like this. "Before we sit down to dinner, my son Pete has something he'd like to share with all of you. Something that brings our family tremendous joy during this season of celebration." Pete stepped forward, his hand finding mine in what I'm sure looked like a gesture of loving support. His smile was confident, proud, the expression of a man who believed he was about to announce the greatest achievement of his life. "Thank you all for being here tonight," he began, his voice carrying easily across the silent room. "This Christmas is special for the Holbrook family because we're celebrating the future. In just a few months, we'll be welcoming a new generation." Murmurs of approval rippled through the crowd. Several people began applauding before Pete raised his hand to continue. "I know many of you have heard rumors, and I'm excited to confirm that they're true. We are expecting a baby." The applause was immediate and enthusiastic. Congratulations echoed from every corner of the room as Pete basked in the attention and approval of Connecticut's social elite. But I noticed he'd been very careful with his language. He hadn't said that his wife was pregnant, he'd said we were expecting a baby. The distinction was subtle but important because it left room for the clarification that was coming. However, Pete continued, raising his voice slightly to regain attention, "There's more to the story than you might expect." The room quieted again, sensing that something significant was about to be revealed. Sophia moved closer to Pete's side, her expression radiating maternal pride and anticipation. "The woman carrying our child isn't Lauren," Pete said, his words falling into the sudden silence like stones into still water. "Her name is Elisha Solomon and she's here tonight to meet all of you." The stunned silence that followed was broken only by the soft sound of someone's champagne flute hitting the marble floor. I watched faces around the room process this information, trying to understand what they'd just heard. Then the whispers started, shocked murmurs as people tried to make sense of an announcement that defied every social convention they understood. That's when the dining room doors opened, and Elisha Solomon walked into the room. She was radiant in a way that only pregnant women can be, her condition obvious beneath an elegant maternity dress that had clearly been selected to complement the evening's formal atmosphere. She moved with quiet confidence, one hand resting protectively on her rounded belly. But as she joined Pete at the front of the room, I saw something in her eyes that the rest of the guests probably missed. She looked nervous, uncertain, like someone playing a role she wasn't entirely comfortable with. "Everyone," Pete said, his arm sliding around Elisha's waist with practiced ease. "I'd like you to meet Elisha Solomon, the mother of my child." The room erupted in confusion. Voices rose as people tried to understand what they were witnessing. A few guests glanced toward me, clearly wondering how I was reacting to my husband's public announcement of his infidelity. I smiled serenely and began reaching into my clutch for the Christmas gift that would turn their confusion into absolute chaos. The confused murmur that filled the room after Pete's announcement was exactly what I'd been waiting for. 60 of Connecticut's most influential people stood in stunned silence, trying to process what they'd just witnessed. Some looked scandalized, others appeared calculating the social implications, but all of them were completely focused on the unfolding drama. "Perfect. I know this is unexpected," Pete continued, his voice carrying that confident tone I'd once found so attractive. "But I want everyone to understand that this isn't a scandal or a mistake. This is a carefully planned decision that we've made as a family." Sophia stepped forward, her composure returning as she moved into damage control mode. "What Pete is trying to explain is that modern families sometimes require modern solutions. Elisha is a brilliant young woman who shares our values and our vision for the future." I watched the faces around the room as they struggled to understand what modern solutions meant in the context of a married man announcing his pregnant girlfriend to a room full of socialites. The whispers were growing louder, more pointed. "Lauren," Judge Arnold Harlan called out, his voice cutting through the murmur. "How do you feel about this arrangement?" All eyes turned to me. Pete's expression showed a flicker of concern, the first crack in his confident facade. Sophia's smile remained fixed, but her eyes sharpened as she waited to see how I would react to the public humiliation they'd orchestrated. This was the moment they expected me to break down, to create a scene that would overshadow their announcement and make me look like the hysterical, abandoned wife. They were counting on my emotional reaction to distract from the deeper questions about their modern family solution. Instead, I smiled graciously and stepped forward to join Pete and Elisha at the front of the room. "Actually, I'm delighted to finally meet Elisha," I said, my voice warm and clear. "Pete has told me so much about her work at Meridian Reproductive Sciences. Her expertise in genetic analysis has been invaluable to our family planning." The room's energy shifted again. Instead of a betrayed wife confronting her husband's mistress, I was presenting myself as a willing participant in whatever arrangement they'd created. The guests looked even more confused now, unsure whether they were witnessing a scandal or some kind of progressive relationship structure. Elisha's eyes widened slightly. She clearly hadn't expected me to know about her professional background, or to react with such calm acceptance. "Yes," Sophia said quickly, seizing on my apparent cooperation. "Lauren has been wonderfully supportive throughout this entire process. She understands that sometimes traditional approaches to family building need to be supplemented." I nodded enthusiastically. "Absolutely. In fact, I've been so grateful for the family's support during my own medical consultations. Dr. Mitchell at Meridian has been incredibly helpful with my genetic optimization treatments." Now it was Pete's turn to look confused. We'd never discussed genetic optimization treatments, and he knew it. But he couldn't contradict me without revealing that he'd been conducting medical procedures behind my back. "The important thing," I continued, moving closer to Elisha, "is that we're all working together toward the same goal, creating the healthiest possible children for the Holbrook family line." I placed my hand gently on Elisha's arm, studying her face as I spoke. She was beautiful, intelligent, and clearly uncomfortable with the attention. But there was something else in her expression, a flicker of recognition when I mentioned Dr. Mitchell's name. "Elisha," I said softly, "I hope you don't mind me asking, but how far along are you?" 28 weeks, she replied, her voice barely above a whisper. And the genetic testing has all come back positive? Everything looks healthy? Yes, everything looks perfect. Her hand moved protectively to her belly. The baby is developing exactly as expected. That's wonderful news, I said, reaching into my clutch. In fact, I have a little Christmas gift that I think will interest everyone here tonight. Something that shows just how successful our family's genetic planning has been. I pulled out the elegantly wrapped package, its red velvet ribbon catching the light from the chandeliers. The room fell completely silent as I held it up for everyone to see. "What's this?" Pete asked, his voice tight with sudden concern. "Just some recent lab results," I said cheerfully. I thought Christmas dinner would be the perfect time to share them with the family. Sophia's composure finally cracked. Her smile faltered as she stared at the package in my hands. "Lauren dear, perhaps this isn't the right time." "Oh, but it's the perfect time," I interrupted, my voice still warm and friendly. After all, Pete just shared his wonderful news about the baby. I think everyone would love to hear about the genetic testing results we've received. I began untying the ribbon slowly, deliberately. The silence in the room was absolute now, the kind of tension that occurs when everyone senses something momentous is about to happen, but no one knows exactly what. "You see," I said, still working on the ribbon, "when you're dealing with advanced reproductive medicine, genetic compatibility is absolutely crucial. It's not enough just to create a baby, you want to create the right baby, with the right genetic markers, from the right parents." Pete stepped toward me, his hand reaching for the package. "Lauren, maybe we should discuss this privately." "Why would we want to discuss it privately?" I asked, pulling the package away from his reach. "This is family news. And look at all these wonderful family friends who are here to celebrate with us." I gestured toward the crowd of frozen faces, all watching our interaction with the kind of horrified fascination usually reserved for natural disasters. "Besides," I continued, finally removing the ribbon and beginning to unwrap the package, "I think everyone will find these results absolutely fascinating, especially the paternity analysis." Elisha went completely white. Sophia made a sound that might have been a gasp or a choke. Pete's hand dropped to his side as he stared at the package like it contained a live bomb. "You see," I said, opening the wrapping paper to reveal the leather-bound folder inside, "genetic testing can tell us so many interesting things, not just about health and development, but about family relationships, about who's really related to whom." I opened the folder, revealing the first page of DNA analysis results printed on official laboratory letterhead. "For instance," I said, my voice carrying clearly across the silent room, "these results show that while Elisha's baby is definitely a Holbrook, the father isn't who you might expect." The sound of someone's sharp intake of breath echoed through the room. Pete looked like he might faint. Sophia was backing away from us, her face a mask of growing horror. "Would you like me to read the results aloud?" I asked, cheerfully. "I think everyone would find them absolutely riveting." That's when Pete made the mistake that sealed his fate. Instead of trying to maintain his composure, or asking for privacy, he lunged forward and tried to grab the folder from my hands. "Give me that," he hissed, his mask of confidence finally slipping completely. I stepped back easily, holding the folder out of his reach. "Oh, Pete," I said, my voice filled with mock disappointment. "Is that any way to treat your wife in front of all these lovely guests?" The room erupted. People began talking all at once, some moving closer to get a better view, others backing toward the exits. Cameras appeared as guests began documenting what was clearly about to become the social scandal of the decade. And in the center of it all, I stood holding the evidence that would destroy the Holbrook family forever, smiling like I was about to distribute Christmas cookies instead of life sentences. "Since Pete seems eager to hear these results," I said, my voice cutting through the chaos with scientific precision, "let me share what our family's genetic testing has revealed." I opened the folder and pulled out the first document, holding it high enough for everyone to see the official laboratory letterhead. "This is a paternity analysis conducted on DNA samples from Elisha's baby, compared against genetic material from several potential fathers." I paused, letting the implications sink in. "The results are quite illuminating." Pete's face had gone from pale to gray. "Lauren, please. The baby Elisha is carrying is definitely a biological member of the Holbrook family, I continued, ignoring his plea. But the father isn't Pete. Gasps echoed through the room. Elisha swayed slightly, one hand gripping the fireplace mantel for support. According to the genetic markers, I said, consulting the document with the calm professionalism of a scientist presenting research findings, the biological father is someone much closer to the family patriarch, someone who shares 50% genetic material with Pete, rather than the 0% we'd expect if Pete were the father. Understanding dawned on several faces in the crowd. Judge Harlan actually took a step backward, his expression horrified. "That's impossible," Sophia whispered, but her voice carried no conviction. "Is it?" I asked, pulling out a second document, because these genetic comparison charts tell a very different story about Holbrook family relationships. I held up a genealogical chart that looked like a family tree, but with DNA percentages instead of simple family connections. You see, when you conduct comprehensive genetic analysis on a family that's been keeping detailed bloodline records for generations, you discover some fascinating patterns. I pointed to specific sections of the chart, patterns that suggest the Holbrook genetic legacy isn't quite as pure as everyone believed. "Stop," Sophia said, her voice cracking. "Just stop." "But we're just getting to the interesting part," I replied cheerfully. Because the paternity results for Elisha's baby reveal that the father shares exactly the genetic markers we'd expect from Arnold Holbrook. The name hung in the air like a physical presence. Arnold Holbrook, Pete's father, Sophia's husband, the family patriarch who died 3 years earlier. "That's impossible," Pete stammered. "My father died before Elisha and before you ever started your affair." I finished. "You're absolutely right. But the genetic evidence doesn't lie. This baby carries Arnold Holbrook's DNA markers." I pulled out another document, which leads us to the really fascinating discovery. It turns out that Arnold Holbrook had been conducting genetic experiments for decades longer than anyone realized, including some very personal experiments. Elisha made a sound that might have been a sob or a gasp. Her hand was pressed against her mouth, her eyes wide with growing horror. "The genetic analysis shows that Elisha Solomon isn't just the daughter of your former security chief," I said, my voice carrying clearly through the stunned silence. "She's also Arnold Holbrook's biological daughter, which makes her Pete's half-sister." The revelation hit the room like a physical blow. Several people actually staggered. Someone screamed. Judge Harlan's champagne glass shattered against the marble floor. "And that means," I continued relentlessly, "that the baby Elisha is carrying isn't just the result of an affair. It's the product of incest, brother and sister producing a child together, all orchestrated by a family so obsessed with genetic purity that they've been committing crimes against nature for generations." Pete collapsed into a chair, his face buried in his hands. Elisha was openly weeping now, the full horror of what had been done to her finally becoming clear. But Sophia was staring at me with pure hatred, her elegant mask finally slipping away to reveal the monster underneath. "You have no idea what you've done," she hissed. "No idea what you've destroyed." "Oh, but I do," I replied, pulling out the final document from my folder. "Because destroying your family's criminal conspiracy was exactly what I intended to do." I held up a thick stack of papers bound in red covers. "These are copies of all the evidence I've gathered over the past 3 months. Financial records showing illegal human experimentation, medical files proving systematic drugging and genetic manipulation without consent, recorded conversations discussing murder, and genetic proof that your family has been committing incest for generations while hiding it behind a facade of social respectability." The room was in complete chaos now. People were shouting, pushing toward the exits, pulling out phones to call lawyers or journalists or police. "The authorities already have copies of everything," I announced over the noise. "FBI, state police, medical licensing boards, university ethics committees. By tomorrow morning, every detail of the Holbrook genetic conspiracy will be public knowledge." That's when Sophia finally snapped completely. "You destroyed everything," she shrieked, lunging toward me with her hands extended like claws. "Everything we built, everything we worked for." But I was ready for her. and I had one more revelation that would end her forever. As Sophia lunged toward me, I stepped aside with the calm precision of someone who'd anticipated exactly this reaction. She stumbled, her designer heels catching on the Persian rug, and nearly fell before Judge Harlan caught her arm. "Careful, Sophia," I said, my voice steady despite the chaos erupting around us. "We wouldn't want you to hurt yourself before you hear the rest of the story." "There is no rest of the story," she snarled, jerking away from the judge's steadying hand. "You've destroyed everything with your lies and fabrications." "Lies?" I asked, pulling out another folder from my clutch. "Then perhaps you can explain these financial records showing payments from the Holbrook Foundation to Thomas Solomon's killer." The room, which had been buzzing with shocked conversations, fell silent again. Even the people who'd been edging toward the exits stopped moving. "That's right," I continued, opening the folder to reveal bank statements and payment receipts. "I didn't just discover your genetic crimes, I solved your murder conspiracy as well." Sophia's face went white, then gray, then an unhealthy shade of green. "You don't know what you're talking about, don't I?" I held up a payment receipt dated 3 days before Thomas Solomon's car accident. $50,000 paid to Nicholas Harlan, not our judge friend here, but his cousin, who runs an auto repair shop in Hartford. The same auto repair shop that serviced Thomas Solomon's car the week before his brake failure. Judge Harlan turned toward his cousin, who was standing near the dining room entrance looking like he wanted to disappear through the floor. "Nicholas," the judge said, his voice heavy with dread, "please tell me this isn't what it looks like." Before Nicholas could answer, I pulled out another document. "It gets better. Here's the insurance claim filed on Thomas Solomon's car after the accident. The brake lines had been professionally severed using tools that required mechanical expertise. The kind of expertise someone with an auto repair background would possess." "You killed him," Elisha whispered, staring at Sophia with dawning horror. "You killed my father because he was going to expose what you'd done to me." Thomas Solomon discovered that his 6-month-old daughter had been conceived using genetic material from his employer, I explained to the stunned crowd. He found out that Arnold Holbrook had artificially inseminated Thomas's wife without her knowledge or consent, creating a child that carried Holbrook DNA, while appearing to be the security chief's legitimate daughter. Pete looked up from his hands, his face stricken. "Mom, tell me this isn't true." But Sophia's silence was answer enough. "When Thomas threatened to go to the authorities," I continued, "the family had him murdered and made it look like an accident. Then they spent the next 25 years monitoring Elisha, funding her education, and planning to use her as breeding stock when she came of age." I turned to face Elisha directly. "They didn't just manipulate your relationship with Pete, they engineered your entire life. Your scholarships, your job at Meridian, even your medical treatments to enhance fertility, all of it was designed to prepare you for this moment." Elisha was sobbing now, the full scope of the manipulation finally becoming clear. "But I thought, Pete said he loved me." "Pete was following orders," I said, not unkindly. "Just like I was following orders when I married him. We were both pawns in Sophia's genetic chess game." That's when the sirens became audible outside. Through the tall windows we could see the flashing lights of police cars and FBI vehicles surrounding the estate. "You called them," Sophia said, her voice flat with defeat. "I called them 3 hours ago," I confirmed. "Gave them enough time to surround the property and prevent anyone from leaving before the truth came out." The front doors burst open, and federal agents poured into the foyer. The guests who'd been trying to leave found themselves facing a wall of law enforcement officers with weapons drawn. "Sophia Holbrook," called the lead agent, holding up a badge and an arrest warrant. "You're under arrest for conspiracy to commit murder, human trafficking, illegal human experimentation, and violation of federal bioethics regulations." As the agents moved through the crowd, reading rights and sorting witnesses from suspects, I walked over to where Elisha sat crying into her hands. "I'm sorry," I said quietly, sitting beside her. "I know this is devastating, but you deserve to know the truth about what they did to you, what they did to both of us." She looked up at me through her tears. "How long have you known?" "About Pete's affair." "A few months." "About the genetic conspiracy." "About 6 weeks." "About your father's murder, and your true parentage." I paused, I figured that out 3 days ago. Pete was being handcuffed now, his rights being read while he stared at me with something that might have been admiration mixed with horror. You planned all of this, he said, as the agents prepared to lead him away. Every detail, yes, I replied simply. Just like your family planned every detail of my life since I was 18 years old. The difference is, my plan was designed to deliver justice instead of exploitation. As Pete was led away, I turned back to Elisha. The baby you're carrying isn't responsible for any of this, and neither are you, but you both deserve a life free from the Holbrook family's manipulation. She nodded, still crying but with something that looked like relief beginning to replace the horror in her eyes. The most powerful family in Connecticut was about to become the most notorious criminals in New England. And it had all started with a Christmas gift wrapped in red velvet ribbon. As Sophia was led away in handcuffs, she turned back to me one final time. Her elegant facade had completely crumbled, revealing the desperate monster underneath. You think you've won? She spat, her voice cracking with rage. You think destroying us makes you better than us. I stood up slowly, straightening my emerald dress and smoothing my hair. Around us, FBI agents were photographing evidence, taking statements from witnesses, and securing the crime scene that had once been Connecticut's most prestigious Christmas dinner. No, Sophia, I said calmly. Destroying you doesn't make me better than you. Being better than you is what enabled me to destroy you. The words hit her like a physical blow. For perhaps the first time in her life, Sophia Holbrook had no comeback, no manipulation, no way to maintain control of the situation. Judge Harlan approached me as the agents led Sophia away. Dr. Jonas, he said formally. What you've done here tonight, it took tremendous courage. It took a PhD in genetics, and 3 months of methodical investigation, I corrected. Courage was just the final ingredient. The judge nodded gravely. The evidence you've presented will ensure that justice is served. These crimes, he shook his head. I've never seen anything like this level of systematic manipulation. As the crowd of witnesses was processed and released, many of them stopped to speak with me. Some offered support, others seemed awed by what they'd witnessed, and a few appeared to be calculating how to distance themselves from the Holbrook scandal. Mitchell was among the last to be arrested, led away still protesting his innocence, despite the recorded conversations where he'd discussed murder with casual indifference. Nicholas Harlan confessed immediately when confronted with the financial evidence, apparently relieved to finally unburden himself of 25 years of guilt over Thomas Solomon's murder. As the estate emptied of guests and law enforcement, I found myself alone with Elisha in the grand foyer where this had all begun. What happens now? She asked, one hand protectively covering her belly. Now you get to choose your own life for the first time, I said. Your baby will grow up knowing the truth about her family, but she'll also grow up free from their manipulation. Her? I smiled. The genetic analysis showed female chromosomes. You're having a daughter. Elisha began crying again. But these were different tears. A daughter who'll never have to be anyone's breeding stock. Never, I confirmed. I made sure of that. The FBI agent in charge approached us with release forms. Dr. Jonas, we'll need you to testify when this goes to trial, but you're free to go for now. What you've accomplished here, it's going to take down one of the most sophisticated criminal conspiracies we've ever seen. As I walked out of the Holbrook estate for the last time, I passed under the family crest that had hung above the front door for 7 generations. By tomorrow it would be evidence in a federal crime scene. The girl from Highland Park who'd been selected as genetic breeding stock had just delivered justice to one of America's most powerful families, and I'd done it all with a Christmas gift wrapped in red ribbon. Perfect. 6 months later, I stood in the courtroom as the judge read the final sentences. Sophia Holbrook, life in prison without parole for murder, conspiracy, and human trafficking. Pete, 25 years for conspiracy and genetic crimes. Dr. Mitchell, 30 years for illegal human experimentation. Nicholas Harlan, 15 years for murder. The Holbrook name, once synonymous with prestige and power, was now permanently associated with one of the most shocking criminal conspiracies in American history. I'd returned to my maiden name and moved back to Detroit, where I opened a genetic counseling practice focused on helping victims of medical manipulation. My first client was Elisha, who'd given birth to a healthy daughter she named Hope. I wanted her to represent everything her life could be, Elisha explained as we watched the baby sleep peacefully in her crib. Everything mine wasn't allowed to be. The Holbrook Foundation had been dissolved, its assets redistributed to legitimate genetic research organizations and victims' families. The mansion in Greenwich was sold, the proceeds funding scholarships for first-generation college students, real scholarships, with no hidden agendas. My mother visited my new practice on opening day, her eyes bright with pride as she looked around the clean, simple office that bore no resemblance to the opulent world I'd escaped. "You found your way back to yourself," she said, hugging me tight. "That's all I ever wanted for you." The final irony came in a letter I received from Pete, written from federal prison. He apologized for the deception, claimed he genuinely loved me, and asked if I could ever forgive him. I wrote back a single sentence: "Love built on lies isn't love at all." That evening, as I sat in my modest apartment overlooking the Detroit River, I reflected on how far I'd traveled from that scared scholarship girl, who'd thought she'd won the lottery by marrying into wealth. I'd learned that the only victory worth having is the one where you remain true to yourself. The only legacy worth building is one based on truth, justice, and the radical idea that human beings aren't laboratory experiments. My phone buzzed with a text from Elisha, a photo of baby Hope reaching for a colorful toy. "She smiled for the first time today," the message read. "I think she knows she's free." I smiled too, looking out at the city where I'd been born, where I'd learned that intelligence and integrity were the only currencies that mattered. The girl from Highland Park had come home, and she'd brought justice with her. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.